Okay. I'm hoping that everybody can hear me at this point, and I apologize for any technical difficulties that we may be experiencing. I'm going to go ahead and take you through what we are going to be talking about today. I'm going to start with an overview of social media and technology to just kind of give the lay of the land of where we are in terms of those issues. Then we'll move right into cyberbullying, talking about some of the forms of cyberbullying and how it's affecting our youth. Importantly, we will discuss preventing cyberbullying, and then finally and importantly, responding to cyberbullying. The formal part of the presentation will be about 45 minutes, and then we hope to leave about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. So let me move right into talking about social media and technology. Certainly, technology has transformed the way that we do education, we socialize with others, and there's a lot of positives that come with it. It lets us connect with people, share information, stay updated, and use high-interest interactive tools and apps. I'm sure there's many teachers who love using Kahoot and Quizlet and other sorts of apps like that, and probably many of us on this webinar enjoy using Facebook and other things like that. And teens are no exception. We know that 92% of them go online daily. Most of them are going on several times per day, and about 24% say they're going on almost constantly. So what are they using? What are the social media and apps out there? There are thousands, and those of you who work in schools are probably more familiar with these than you would like to be, whether it's Vine, Twitter, Facebook, Google+, Snapchat. We tend to see that girls are more likely to use the visually oriented social media platforms, so things like Instagram and Snapchat, and boys are more likely to play video games. About 84% of boys report that they play video games online or on phone. And anyone who works with middle school students or late elementary are probably very familiar with things like Minecraft, which seems to grab the attention of boys like almost nothing else. So what are teens doing in terms of sharing personal information on social media? These are data from Pew Research Center that is showing that most teens are sharing personal information about themselves on social media sites, whether that be their photo, their name, and where they live. The good news is that about 60% of teen Facebook users are keeping their profiles private, so that only folks that they're friends with on Facebook can see those. In contrast, when we look at Twitter use, only about 24% are keeping those private, which makes a bit of sense because one of the purposes of Twitter is really to get information out there publicly for others to see and hear. Facebook friendships also tend to reflect the relationships that kids have in real life. So about 98% are friends on Facebook with people from school, and encouragingly, about 70% are friends with their parents. Now, we'll spend the bulk of this time talking about cyberbullying, which is obviously a negative social media experience. But I do think it's important to note that teens by far are reporting more positive than negative online experiences. So I'm not going to go through all these statistics, but basically it's a minority that are sharing information that they later realized was a problem or getting in trouble for their social media usage. Now, what about social media and privacy? Again, we're finding that teens are taking active steps to try to shape their reputation and keep their information private. So these are, again, some statistics from Pew Research Center that's talking about how often teens have deleted people from their network, deleted or edited a past post, untagged themselves, or things like that. So let's move into cyberbullying. There are many definitions of cyberbullying, and of course, because we're in New York State, I'm going to use the definition as per the Dignity for All Students Act. And I'm sure you're all aware that cyberbullying was added as an amendment to DASA, and that took effect July 1st, 2013. So the first part of the definition that I'm going to read is the definition of bullying, harassment in DASA, and then the last part is specifically related to the mechanism of cyberbullying. So harassment and bullying, according to DASA, is the creation of a hostile environment by conduct or threats, intimidation, or abuse. And it's the conduct that has or would have the effect of unreasonably and substantially interfering with a student's education performance, opportunities, or well-being, or reasonably causes or would reasonably be expected to cause a student to fear for his or her physical safety, or reasonably causes or would reasonably be expected to cause physical injury or emotional harm to a student. And it's stated that this can occur off school property, and if it creates or would foreseeably create a risk of substantial disruption within the school environment, or that it might reach school property, that it is covered under this. So cyberbullying specifically includes all behaviors described above where the harassment or bullying occurs through any form of electronic communication. So that can be on the internet, through texting, cell phones, things like that. So at this point, I'd like to ask a polling question of you, and just want your opinion about what you think to this question. True or false? Cyberbullying is the most common form of bullying among teens. So just go ahead and click whether or not you think that is true or false, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. Okay, so the forms of cyberbullying, just like the definition of cyberbullying, there is some variability in what people are considering different forms of cyberbullying. So depending on who you read or who you listen to, you might hear different forms. I'm just going to review some of these. One form is flaming and trolling. So that's the exchanging of insults or sending or posting angry, hostile, vulgar, or annoying messages that are designed explicitly to provoke the target's emotion. So certainly any website that has anonymous posting, if you go to news websites, some of the things that people are posting are just designed to annoy or inflame others. Photoshopping, tagging, or untagging is linking of someone to a photo, a statement, a video, or a link that someone doesn't want to be associated with. So that would be posting the picture of someone that is disliked or is ugly or something like that, and then putting somebody else's name next to it and saying, this reminds me of so-and-so. Outing and trickery is getting information about someone that they think is personal and then or private, and then sharing it, or posting private information about someone that someone doesn't want posted. Online harassment and physical threats. You know, the online harassment is repeated sending of insulting or offensive messages, or disseminating harmful or untrue information. That's more denigration, actually, about a person. And certainly making physical threats can still happen online. And then finally, identity theft or impersonating. That's where you're pretending to be somebody else and then sending messages to others or making posts that would make it sound like it's from that person, even though you're not really that person. A variation of this, or a type of this, is catfishing, which is creating a fake profile to lure someone into a deceitful romantic relationship. There's certainly some high-profile examples of that, and obviously the effects have been quite devastating. So many cyberbullying and bullying researchers see cyberbullying as one form of bullying, as opposed to this very distinct concept or construct. And I'm certainly one of those. You know, we know that there's a lot of overlap between cyberbullying and other forms of bullying. On the other hand, there are some parts of cyberbullying that really make it distinct. And certainly the viral nature of it, or the reach, the fact that so many people can have this information about others at just the touch of a fingertip, makes it unique. Clearly, the anonymity is another feature of cyberbullying that makes it distinct. You can post information about people, you can send messages, and you don't have to reveal your identity, which can make it easier to be more offensive or to do things that you might not do face-to-face. And finally, the power aspect is a bit different in cyberbullying than in other forms of bullying, in that power may be that someone is more technologically savvy than another person. And I think another important thing to note about cyberbullying is oftentimes the so-called perpetrator is also a victim. In other words, it goes back and forth much of the time between two people. So whereas in bullying, we tend to talk about bullies and perpetrators, and there's certainly some that are bullies and victims both. This is even more common in cyberbullying. So maybe if we can take a look now at what you thought about that polling question, true or false, whether or not cyberbullying is the most common form of bullying among teens today. Okay, so it looks like we had 79% of you said that this is true, and 20% said that is false. Okay, you've got to love it when someone asks a question and then tricks you. And I didn't mean to trick you. I think it really is a very common misunderstanding that cyberbullying is the most prevalent form of bullying out there and is the most problematic. I think it's because, honestly, for many of us, it's a newer form of bullying. It's something that didn't happen when many of us were growing up. We just didn't have the technology, and we're probably spending a lot of time dealing with it as well. Although the data are pretty consistent in saying that cyberbullying is actually less common than other forms of traditional bullying. So these charts show results from a meta-analysis of about 80 studies conducted just in 2014, which is showing that traditional forms of bullying, so that's physical, verbal, relational, are more than 2 times as common as cyberbullying. I also think it's important to note that cyberbullying and other forms of bullying are slowly decreasing over time. I think this is another thing that oftentimes we don't believe is the truth, but our large-scale surveillance data have shown this to be the case. So, for instance, you may be familiar with the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention conducts. So in 2011, they found that 16.2% of high school students reported being cyberbullied. When they did a follow-up 2 years later in 2013, that number decreased to 14.8% of high school students. So again, it's not a huge decrease, but it's consistent, showing that we are either maintaining these bullying rates or they are slightly decreasing over time. So let's move into prevention. Clearly, prevention starts long before an incident occurs. I'm sure many of you want to get right into what do we do about this, how do we respond? And I think a lot of the messages, it starts with prevention. You know, what are the things that you're already doing to promote a positive school climate that are going to help to give youth the behaviors, the skills that they need so that they're not going to be engaging in some of these more problematic behaviors. So these are our comprehensive and systematic efforts. Positive behavioral interventions and supports as an example of a multi-tiered framework that uses behavioral principles to try to be really clear about what the expectations are, and then to also provide behavioral interventions for students who aren't responding to our more universal rules and expectations and strategies. Certainly social emotional learning programs and approaches. These are things like Second Step and other sorts of programs that are systematically trying to teach our youth social and emotional skills, communicating appropriately, problem solving, empathy, decision making, that are going to be helpful for them in making good decisions, in hopefully being good citizens and entering the workforce and things like that. And if you don't already know, social emotional learning programs are also related to better academic achievement. So schools that use these programs see about 11 points higher in standardized achievement test results than schools that aren't using social emotional learning programs. Something else that I'll talk quite a bit about in the webinar is the use of progressive consequences versus a more zero tolerance approach. So zero tolerance being any sort of rule violation will be met with very harsh and severe, swift punishment to send the message that rule breaking isn't okay. We really know that having more progressive and flexible consequences are better for our youth, and I'll talk more specifically about that. I think it's really important to emphasize collaborative efforts so that all staff in the school, anyone from our library and media specialists to our teachers, our administrators, our bus drivers, our lunch monitors, our janitorial staff are really clear about the expectations for behavior and know how to respond when there's violations of these. Certainly, I want to make sure that everybody knows that cyberbullying and bullying are not school problems. School gets a lot of the legislation, a lot of the pressure to deal with them. That's where we're congregating the most, and quite a bit of it is happening there. But in order to systematically prevent these issues and respond to them, it does take a village. We need the parents involved. We need the parents to know what we know about what cyberbullying is, what other forms of bullying are, how to prevent them, what they can do to be helping with this. Involving the students as well, particularly since this is an issue that tends to affect kids as they get older. And I know we probably have folks that are working with elementary age that can tell us a lot of incidents of social media use and things like that. But especially as kids get older, they really look to their peers more for norms and information and values. So getting them involved is important. And certainly partnering with our law enforcement and community agencies is critical. And I'll talk a little bit more about that specifically with regard to law enforcement in just a bit. I just want to briefly review for you some of the major components of the Dignity for All Students Act. Just as a reminder, that the policy and the code of conduct in age-appropriate, plain language that prohibits discrimination and harassment of students by students and or employees is required as part of DASA. Just want to note that it does not cover student behavior harassment towards adults. This is really adults, school staff, or students on students that are protected in the Dignity for All Students Act. But certainly the code of conduct needs to be available on the website. People need to get copies of it, need to know what bullying and harassment are and what will happen when these incidents are reported. Each school also has a Dignity Act coordinator, so at least one staff member at every school in New York State, every public and charter school that's designated as the Dignity Act coordinator. This is really the go-to person for students. That person's name and contact information should be in the code of conduct, posted on the school website. And this person is thoroughly trained to handle human relations in the areas of protected classes, as well as discrimination, bullying, and harassment. I should note there's no specific or set standardized training for this person, but clearly the expectation is that that person be trained for those responsibilities. Many times that's an administrator, sometimes that's a mental health professional, and there's certainly many schools that have both people in that position, which we think is a good model. The instruction for students within civility, citizenship, and character education, making sure that information is infused about prohibiting harassment, bullying, and intimidation, including information about those protected classes. School employees also need to be trained about this, need to know how to discourage discrimination and harassment, raise awareness, and enable employees to prevent and respond to this. School employees must all know how to report. I'll spend some time on that as well. And then, of course, there's the annual reporting requirement to New York State Ed, which I will also review in more detail in a bit. Just briefly, again, focusing on prevention and the importance of having clear expectations for conduct. Every school should have a internet use policy where it's real clear about what the internet can and can't be used for, the use of technology in schools. I think most schools are finding that having an outright ban on the use of cell phones and things like that is just not going to work. So we really, just like we can't ban all social media and internet, many schools are very reliant on these things for instruction. So it's really about educating and making clear what's okay and what's not. Part of that is really being committed to digital safety and citizenship, which I'll again touch on more. Having that progressive discipline in place for violations of the code of conduct, and making sure, as I've mentioned before, that everyone knows the expectations. It's not a one-time event or the code of conduct that everybody gets at the beginning of the year and is expected to memorize. But again, when teachers are going through their class syllabus and they're talking about expectations, that's brought up again. It may be in assemblies, it may be in parent nights. It may be through newsletters or things like that, but how are we continually communicating these expectations?